Warning! This video has flashing bright lights that might cause discomfort to some. I have taken some steps to reduce the impact, but it's still a risk you should know about. Anyway, on to the video.
I've been waiting for you, friends.
It's the spoopy time of year, which means that it's time to stab a pumpkin, buy a costume, and play some spoopy games. Whether you're in the mood for something scary or something a little more lighthearted to bask in the charm and aesthetic of the season, you've got plenty of options. Luigi's Mansion, Resident Evil, Ghostbusters the video game, among many others. But you see, I'm a bit irritated because my favorite game series to play during this time of year never makes it onto any of these top whatever games to play during October lists. What series am I talking about?
The House of the Dead.
For those who don't know, these are a series of zombie shooter games where you point a plastic gun at the screen to shoot zombies and deposit quarter after quarter only to die in like 3 minutes because these games are ridiculously hard. The House of the Dead was a household name for a while, but in more recent years has seemingly been forgotten, and it's rarely ever discussed when the subject of classic and influential games is brought up, which I think is a shame because I feel like this game series deserves a lot more credit than it gets. Much like how Mario 64 defined the 3D collectathon platformer, or how Metroid and Castlevania basically created a hodgepodge genre called the Metroidvania, or even how Resident Evil defined the survival horror genre. The House of the Dead is a genre-defining classic that defines the light gun, on-rail shooter genre, whatever you would call this, and it had more of an influence on culture and gaming in general than you might realize. It didn't invent the genre of the on-rail shooter. Games like Virtua Cop and Time Crisis existed before The House of the Dead, but this was the first game that I felt perfected the concept. The House of the Dead exists in this weird middle ground of being somewhat popular and considered a classic, enough to secure a reference in Wreck-It Ralph of all places, and get occasional nods in games like Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing, but I've never had a conversation with anyone about this franchise, and I don't typically see a lot of discourse on YouTube for it. But looking at the context behind this series, the genre of games that we're talking about, and some of the more tragic aspects to its history, it's completely understandable why no one really talks about Sega's de facto zombie shooter franchise. But I care, so let's talk about it. I have a stupid amount of knowledge on the entire House of the Dead series, and I'm a big simp for it. So if you'll humor me for however long this video ends up being, I'd love to share some thoughts, what I love and don't love about the series, and what I hope to see in its future.
Zombie! Bad guy!
Hi, zombie!
Hi, zombie!
In the year 1996, Sega released the first game in the series, simply titled The House of the Dead, or Hot D if you use the acronym. So how this game works: the character moves on their own and you're inserted into their first-person perspective. All you have to worry about is shooting the zombies before they attack you. While The House of the Dead wasn't the first game of its type, it was the first to really refine the formula and play like the types of on-rail shooters that people are more familiar with today. What made this game stand out at the time was the fact that it was about zombies, and zombies equals blood and gore, leading to some controversy in a similar way to how Mortal Kombat was controversial. There were even some arcade units that had an enclosed area with a curtain so that impressionable young souls wouldn't see all the pixelated blood and have their innocence soiled or whatever. This was also at a pivotal moment when zombies were starting to really penetrate into pop culture, and this first game can be credited with helping, to an extent. In other words, this game might be partially responsible for us having films like 28 Days Later and The Walking Dead. You may have heard of it. I also want to share this quote from George A. Romero, aka the father of zombie media, who basically created what we know as the modern zombie. According to Wikipedia, which as we all know is the most definitive source for information, in 2013 he stated that it was, quote, the video games Resident Evil and House of the Dead more than anything else that popularized his zombie concept in mainstream popular culture. This was a shiny brand spanking new game with honkin' graphics for the time and was fun to play while also being hard as balls. And it could also be played with 2 players, encouraging more people to join in on the fun. Okay, so what exactly makes this game special other than the violence and being the first shooter game to really play the way that this game plays? The secret recipe that makes this game special and unique can be summed up using 3 points. This is the super secret zombie House of the Dead recipe. Number 1. charm. This is a game that feels like it came from the 90s, and I mean that in the best possible way. Yes, zombies are creepy, and to a younger me walking by the machine at arcades, I admittedly had a hard time sleeping during those nights. But horror really isn't at the forefront here, at least not to me. To me, this has more of the vibe of something like Disney's Haunted Mansion mixed with an over-the-top action game and a lot of blood. Where games like Resident Evil and Silent Hill were more about becoming intimately familiar with your environment and conserving ammo and resources, House of the Dead is more about quick reflexes as you're taken on a tour through this charming and low polygonal mansion. The tone feels pretty tongue-in-cheek with cheesy dialogue like this.
Oh no!
And this.
But you will never, ever defeat me.
And that combined with the retro 90s graphics and gothic design, this place feels quintessentially Halloween, which is why I'm talking about it for the month of October. The story is pretty easy to understand. Special agents Thomas Rogan and G, who work for the organization known as the A.M.S, show up at a spooky mansion, which is actually a front for an evil scientist named Dr. Roy Curian to conduct monstrous experiments and ultimately create zombies. And, well, that's all the story that you really need. You get to the end, you fight a big boss, the main villain ends up dying, and you have to fight his monstrous creation. You take that down and bada boom bada bing, you save the day. It's very simple, very 90s, very over the top, and I wouldn't have it any other way. The biggest thing elevating this game's charm for me is undoubtedly the music. Holy shit, what a soundtrack for a game. These aren't the spooky and atmospheric songs that you'd find in horror games of the time. Instead, these tracks are designed to get your blood pumping and be incredibly groovy and catchy at the same time, combining elements of techno, hard rock, funk, and that weird spooky whistle that you stereotypically associate with Halloween. It all combines together to create an iconic soundtrack that consistently makes me feel like tapping my foot and rocking my head back and forth. There is a spooky undertone to the music, and under certain circumstances it might make you feel a bit uneasy, but it feels distinctly appropriate for a game about shooting zombies, and I love this soundtrack. Being a super short game, there isn't a lot of music to speak of, but every single track composed for the game slaps harder than. I sometimes listen to the soundtrack on its own, especially around Halloween time. I mean, just listen to some of these tracks. Even the beta music that never made it into the final game kicks ass. In something like Resident Evil, this kind of music would feel distinctly out of place, but here it works extremely well. The funny thing is that the director of the game, Takeshi Oda, wanted to have the game have a more serious tone and be aimed at a more mature audience. Personally, I'm glad the game never turned out like this. The fact that it isn't this grim and depressing game makes it more fun to romp through the spooky mansion. I know everything in this mansion wants to kill me, but I can't help but also feel warm and fuzzy, and luckily that warm and fuzziness also carries into the gameplay, which brings us to our second ingredient. Number 2, shooting feels good. Plain and simple, the shooting is enjoyable because it feels really satisfying to do. Zombies for the most part hobble towards you at a slow pace, but there are generally quite a few on screen and they come at a constant rate. The handgun is loaded with 6 bullets and has to be reloaded frequently by shooting outside of the screen, and if you don't realize that this is what you need to do, this game will be sure to remind you.
outside of the screen.
You can fire off as many bullets in quick succession as your finger is able to do in that short amount of time, and if you're quick at reloading, you can basically turn this handgun into a machine gun. What really makes this work is just how satisfying the sound effects are when you shoot things. It's the weird popping sound mixed with the zombie grunts and occasional sounds of spurting blood. The gunshot sound itself is also just very crisp, and even shooting boxes feels good. I'm not someone who's generally into blood and gore, and I definitely don't need it to make a game good in my eyes, but this is one of those instances where it actively puts me at ease. Well, that makes me sound kinda creepy. Point is, shooty feel good. Taking down zombies split seconds before they inflict damage is satisfying. The game is hard as balls, and sometimes you have fractions of a second to deal enough damage before you get hit, but the frantic nature of the game keeps you on your toes and is always exciting. Compared to light gun games that came before it, those usually had static screens, but the House of the Dead ditched that and made it so that you were fully immersed in the character that you were playing as. Rather than sticking to the same screen for a while as enemies casually enter it, here you're weaving and winding through the mansion, and you can never be too sure about what's around each corner. Zombies can pop up at any moment, and sometimes you just gotta be ready to mash that shoot button. I tend to lose sensation in my index finger by the 3rd level, and I have to resort to using my other fingers. Yeah, this game does cause me a little bit of physical pain, but it's all worth it. There are many different variations of zombies, along with miscellaneous other creatures like bats, frogs, and Michael Jackson. Fun fact, this zombie's name is Ruben. In fact, each zombie model has a distinct name, which I think is kinda cute. Along the way, you're also encouraged to shoot barrels, boxes, and bases, and sometimes you'll get extra points or find extra health, so do it. Each level ends with a boss fight, which breaks up the pace and gives you something new to shoot at. They're pretty difficult, and these were clearly designed to drain quarters from players. But with enough practice and a good enough understanding of the mechanics, they can be defeated without losing a single life torch. Except the last one, because holy shit is he hard. But yeah, the game feels good, and there's still one more ingredient that we have yet to talk about. Number 3, the power of science. Throughout this game, you don't just encounter zombies, evil spiders, Jabba the Hutt's children, and possessed monkeys, but you're also going to come upon innocent people. These are the scientists that work at this mansion, and as you progress through the game, you'll come upon them frequently. And every time you do, they'll just so happen to be seconds away from getting munched on by Larry from down the street. Oh, Larry. Whenever you encounter one, you should do the nice thing and maybe take down the zombie that's about to make their day extra bad. And while you're at it, maybe don't shoot them. It's not fun for anyone, especially since you lose a bit of health when you do. On occasion, saving one of the scientists is going to reward you with a health pack that they just casually have shoved up their ass. If you save all of them by the end of the level, you'll get an extra 2 HP, and 1 extra if you manage to save all but 1. I love their presence in the game because they add a nice bit of extra challenge to the overall experience, and they keep you on your toes since you don't want to accidentally shoot them. There's a bit of a risk-reward system here where if you manage to save the scientists, they give you something that helps you out, but if you end up shooting them on accident, you get penalized, so you have to actively decide what the best course of action is. But that's not even the best part. Did I mention that an average playthrough of this game lasts anywhere from 20 to 24 minutes? Yeah, it's super short, which makes sense given that it was designed to be played in the arcade, but that's where these lovely scientists come into the picture. Not only do they add some variety to the gameplay, but at certain key moments in the game, you can get a completely different experience. Saving a scientist will put you on a certain path, but failing to save them will send you in a different direction, and the level will play out in a different way. This system is similar to Star Fox, another on-rails shooter with branching paths, but it works differently in a few key ways. You're always going to play the same 4 levels in any given playthrough, but the way that you play each chapter can look drastically different. The first level presents you with this guy. Save him, and you go inside the mansion. Let him die, and you go under the mansion through the sewers. Go inside the mansion, and there are monkeys. Shoot the one on the right, and you end up going left up the stairs. Shoot the one on the left, and you go straight down the hall. And so on and so forth, with paths even winding into each other and converging at certain points. You can also change routes by doing things like shooting buttons or shooting random crap in the level, like the floor. There are even a couple of instances where zombies can push you in holes. What I love about this is the spontaneity that it introduces, and how it's directly related to how well you do. I can only imagine the excitement of playing this game for a second or third time in an arcade and being completely shocked when you go down a route that you've never seen before. There are roughly 13 key moments where you can affect your route, but when you account for all the different combinations, there's a surprising amount to see and do in this short little game. It adds so much to the overall quality of the game, boosting replayability, which again is really important given how short the game is, and just making it a lot more fun. Hell, while I was filming this video, I discovered a route that I'd never seen before. Sadly, the further you get into the game, the less prevalent these alternate routes become until they disappear completely in the final level. But since you're more likely to play the earlier levels more frequently, especially if you're not very good at the game, this is a pretty smart decision. This mechanic shouldn't be understated, as it really does make the game so much more interesting to me, and adds an extra layer of difficulty when I want to try a new path. Okay, so this isn't a perfect game, but for what it accomplishes, I think it's clear to see why it's such a classic. The only flaws that I can really see with this game are some occasional dickish enemy placement, and the length of the game, since I would have loved at least one more level. My biggest issue is just with how irritating it is that the entire screen has to flash white every time I shoot or reload. I understand why, it's just how the technology works. This is how the game is able to register where you're pointing your gun at the screen, but it's going to cause discomfort, and the issue is still there even when you emulate the game and use a mouse to play, especially if you shoot frantically, which is kind of what you're supposed to do in this game. Other than that, I think it's an incredibly solid game that set a strong foundation for light gun games and other types of shooters to come. This first installment just puts a smile on my face, and the memories I have of being freaked out by it as a child and eventually giving it a try and being enthralled by the experience will always stick with me. Too bad you can't really play it anymore. So, I guess it's time to talk about the tragedy of the House of the Dead 1. With most of the cabinets having been produced in the 90s and no more being made since then, what exactly are the options for playing this at home? Well, in 1998, Sega released a port for the Sega Saturn. What the hell is this thing?
32-bit RISC processors with 5 additional processors to create a head-snapping 500,000 polygons per second. Wow! Experience Sega Saturn's monster torque and parallel processing power.
The full game is here with extra modes and the exact same gameplay as the arcade version, including support for a light gun, but unfortunately, it looks like ass, draining a lot of the atmosphere of the arcade version. And what is this? A loading screen? In the middle of the level? Okay, well at least the full game is pretty much intact, and there are a few benefits to this version. The music has been amped up slightly, and a lot of the tracks have been extended and built upon, making the versions of the tracks from this version the definitive ones in my opinion. The flashing that happens to the entire screen goes away if you play this with something other than the gun, and it's got extra weapons and characters that you can play as. This is not how you want to play the original game though. Not only do you need a Sega Saturn, the light gun accessory, and a copy of the game, which in America goes for stupid high prices, but you're also going to need an old CRT TV to play this one. One of them chonky boys that looks like this, which is something I doubt most of you watching this video have. This version of the game is a pain to get, and it comes with severe compromises if you don't get everything that's listed here. Other than this version, there was another way to officially play this game, and that came in the form of a PC port, which was based on the Sega Saturn version. Do I need to say anything more? On top of being based on a shittier version of the game, it was sloppily brought over, leading to more jank and glitches. It also has a hard time working on modern computers and won't play any music unless you have the CD loaded in while playing the game. Oh, come on, there's gotta be a better way to play this game at home. I think I remember the House of the Dead on the Wii. Yeah, let's check that out. The House of the Dead 2 and 3 Return.
What?
What kind of sick joke is this? Who puts the second and third game of any series together in a collection without including the first one? How do I play this game? I mean, come on, this is Sega we're talking about. The same Sega that has a serious fetish for re-releasing their classic games on newer hardware. So, why haven't we seen any ports since the Saturn and PC versions? They lost the source code. How does that even happen? Well, to make a long story short, during a corporate reshuffling, Sega's AM1 team that created the original game lost the code for multiple games, including the House of the Dead. There's not really anything Sega can do about it. The original code is lost, and as a result, even if Sega wanted to, which I'm sure they did, there's no way that they could port the best version of this game to any modern consoles. Any modern day release of the game would have to come in the form of a remake. The series was decently popular. I mean, all games after 1 did receive ports to modern consoles, but sadly, the only way to play this classic in its full glory is to either track down an arcade cabinet somewhere in the wild and pray that it works properly, or emulate it on PC, which is good, and using a mouse is much better than using a standard controller, but this'll never live up to the experience of pointing and shooting, which is what the game was designed around. I know that there are ways that you can mod the game to force light gun support, but that seems like a lot of work, and what do I look like to you? A nerd? It makes me sad that this iconic game is essentially lost to all but those who care about it enough to install this emulator, but there is a ray of hope. In April of 2021, during a Nintendo Indie World showcase, it was announced that a full-on remake of the original House of the Dead 1 was being worked on, and we got a look at some footage and even some voice acting. It baffles me that it took 25 years for this game to get made, but this is certainly very promising. As of the recording of this video, the game has yet to be released, and all we really have to go off of as of October 2021 are these screenshots and a bit of trailer footage that they've shown off. I really hope it's good. But I'm also nervous because I've been waiting for a very long time to get this game, and some of what we know so far is leading me to believe that it might not be exactly what I'd hoped for. I could be wrong, but I think my concerns are valid, and in order to properly explain why it is that I'm so nervous, we're gonna have to go through the entire rest of the House of the Dead series and discuss each game. So, without further ado, let's take a deep dive into the rest of the House of the Dead franchise, because this video needed to be longer. I'm sorry.
Farewell, friends.
Alright, well, before we jump into the House of the Dead 2, there were a couple of spin-offs that are worth mentioning. This is what I like to call Spinoff Corner, where we briefly mention things related to the House of the Dead, but not quite full games. Stuff like spin-offs, similar titles, and other surprises. For starters, I'd like to look at a couple of these mobile games that were made for the House of the Dead. The first one was a Japanese exclusive game that simplified the gameplay so you could play it on a phone pad, one of them old boys. And it had 3D graphics. It's impressive given what the game's running on, but it looks super basic and not very engaging. The other game was released on smart devices and is a top-down shoot-'em-up, taking a 16-bit style, which looks pretty good. This is more of the same kind of gameplay from the other game, but with a top-down perspective and different weapons. This one actually looks like it might entertain for a bus ride or two, but again, there's not a lot of depth here beyond that. And now that we've taken this strange detour to talk about House of the Dead mobile games, let's talk about
The House of the Dead.
Sorry, did they forget to hire somebody to say 2? In fact, this is literally the same sound clip as the first game.
The House of the Dead. The House of the Dead.
All joking and goofing aside, this is what I call a good sequel. In other words, this is the Shrek 2 of the House of the Dead right here, and I don't use those words lightly. More levels, more zombies, more blood, and a bunch of other stuff that we're gonna need to go a bit more in depth with, using my handy dandy recipe from before. First up is charm, and I'm about to wipe my ass with this game because holy shit is it charming. To start, let's go over the story. This game released in 1998, and the story takes place in the year 2000. I guess they really like setting these games 2 years into the future for whatever reason. We follow the adventures of James Taylor and Gary Stewart, two dudes working for the same A.M.S. organization that the protagonists from the first game were a part of, and are in fact on their way to meet G. But when they arrive, they get assaulted by this bat-human creature with an Alvin and the Chipmunks filter applied to its voice. And they get assaulted by zombies. Pretty soon, they find G collapsing on the floor, who tells them to meet up with fellow agents Amy Crystal and Harry Harrison. I love this game. After shooting through a bunch of zombies, they eventually confront
Goldman,
the primary antagonist of the game, who is a fantastic character and easily the most memorable in any House of the Dead game, and he reveals that he was actually the mastermind responsible for the incidents from the first game. James and Gary confront him head-on, where he reveals that he was upset with humans for
Disturbing the life cycle of nature.
Anyway, you take down this shiny naked man that looks like the Silver Surfer, and Goldman commits suicide. The end. Or is it? This plot is ridiculously corny, and is elevated by the aspect of the game that is probably the thing that it's most well known for. The voice acting. This is a prime example of so bad it's good dialogue, and at many points, even to this day, I still bust out laughing at some of these lines.
We're meeting G over there.
What?
I don't want to die! My God.
Thank you for rescuing me.
What the hell's going on in this city?
Don't know, but it's very similar to the 1998 Tyrion case.
That case?
What's going on? The city's chaos is increasing.
Well, it's about that. It seems like Goldman.
What? Harry, we'll talk later.
Well, the 1998 Tyrion case. Guess who's behind it? It was Goldman. He's the head one of the most eminent financial group and an expert on the genome theory. We have to stop him.
My friends went inside, but they're not back yet. I told them not to go.
What is it?
People of the A.M.S. I am Goldman.
So this is Goldman's headquarters. What? It's like they're inviting me in.
This is the final battle.
Either way, I'm so happy it is the way that it is. The acting in The House of the Dead 2 is so legendary that it often eclipses any discussion of the game itself. This is the most popular game in the series, but it's usually never discussed in the context of being a great game, but instead is brought up because of this hilarious voice acting, or a certain spin-off game that we'll talk about soon. There's a really good video by Look Korea, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, which dives into the game's voice acting with some good theories on why it ended up the way that it did.
Nobody on the development team spoke a word of English. In fact, the only reason that the series is called The House of the Dead at all is because they took a bunch of spooky-sounding English words, slapped them together into something they thought seemed cool, and then called it a day.
And while I'm recommending other videos, I also recommend this Austin McConnell video on voice acting from the 90s. No longer are you exploring a single mansion, but now the game takes you on a grand tour of Venice, Italy.
The bridge has been destroyed.
What a beautiful city. This setting is perfect, as every corner is drenched in the same gothic atmosphere and spooky vibes that I loved about the first game. Graphics also look slightly better, though the textures are a bit more gross looking here, and the color palette a lot of the time is really brown. Music. The same composer from the first game returned to do this soundtrack, and while this collection of music isn't as consistently good as the first one, the songs that fuck
hard.
This right here, this is the song that plays in Chapter 2, and it's called Muddy, and this is probably my favorite piece of music in the entire franchise. I love it so much. They even bring back the final boss from the first game along with his incredible theme song. So when it comes to charm, I say that this sequel improves on the first game by quite a bit. Ingredient number 2, shooty shooty. Shooting is just as satisfying as before. Actually, it's even better here because I'm not being constantly blinded by the screen flashing white in my eyes. There's more enemy variety overall, but it doesn't change the core shooting very much. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, since decapitating heads and blowing off body parts is simple and clean. Unfortunately, just like the first game, there are some instances where the enemies can be a bit more bullet spongy than I feel like they should be, and we also have the return of some really dickish enemy placement, but for the most part when I took damage, it felt like my fault, and the game is also nice and difficult, just like the first. Compared to the first game, this is also quite a bit longer, with a total of 6 levels. They're a tad shorter overall, but give the game a slightly longer runtime, and they also added more zombie types and bosses. You have classic default zombies, axe boys, slugs, frogs, bats, etc, etc. And you also have new enemy types like these robots, zombies that puke their heart out, and chainsaw zombies now have 2 chainsaws. We also have some unique and inventive boss fights with things like this Hydra, swamp monster, and this big chainsaw boy. They're quite difficult, and there is another aspect to these guys that makes them a bit different from how the first game's bosses operated. But in order to get into that, I'm going to have to talk about ingredient number 3, people. No longer are you specifically rescuing scientists, but the lovely citizens of Venice.
Thank you for rescuing me.
You're very welcome. They function in the exact same way as the scientists from the first game, netting you extra health on occasion and taking away your life if you commit murder. And like before, they're integrated into this branching path system, where sometimes saving a person will put you on a certain path and letting them die will put you on a separate path. And depending on which route you take, you won't immediately get funneled into the same destination like you would in the first game. Instead, you'll end up at one of 2 potential destinations, and you'll fight the exact same boss, but the arena can be slightly different. For instance, you can fight this boss on a bridge or at a dock, and the attack patterns are also slightly different depending on where you decide to fight the boss. Your choice also carries into the next level, determining which side you'll start at and giving opportunities to swap back and forth between paths. This interconnectivity between the levels is genius, and I only wish that we could have seen more of it. The last 2 chapters ditch alternate paths, and I really wish we could have gotten just a bit more from this mechanic. But as it stands, I do consider this to be quite an improvement over the first game. This is peak House of the Dead right here, and I couldn't be happier. So there we have it. Everything I love about the series has returned, and in some cases has even been improved. Also, Typing of the Dead is a game that exists. No, I'm not joking. This is a real game made by the real Sega and takes the House of the Dead 2 that you know and love and replaces the shooting with typing. All guns are replaced with keyboards and it looks so fucking goofy, but I love it. If it weren't for the blood and gore, this would honestly make a perfect tool for teaching kids how to type quickly and efficiently. Small changes are made to the game, but for the most part, it retains the same level layout and enemy placement. Boss fights have been tailored to this style of game, and each has a new gimmick that puts a different spin on the typing action. And I think a lot of creativity was put into this concept. It's genuinely a good time, and this is a game that I'd recommend checking out if you know where to get it. Okay, so I love the bad voice acting and how ridiculous the Typing of the Dead is just on its concept alone, and actually playing it, yeah, it's wacky. But I feel like that ridiculousness overshadows any discussion on the House of the Dead as a game series. Video Game Donkey, Terminal Montage, even OG Game Grumps each have videos for the series, but those videos are about Typing the Dead specifically, which makes sense because it's more ripe for comedy and making silly jokes, but anytime this series is brought up, it's just so that we could laugh about this game and then move on.
Probably one of the most stupidest games ever.
In other words, I'd wager that more people are familiar with Typing of the Dead than House of the Dead. House of the Dead 2 deserves more than that, and should be discussed for how silly it is, yes, but I'd also like to have discussions on the gameplay and the music and other aspects. Hey, any exposure for this franchise is better than nothing. Objectively, both of these are an improvement on the original game in just about every way, and it's clear to see why this is what people think of when the House of the Dead is brought up. But personally, while I love this game to pieces and can easily recognize it as the best in the franchise, I think I still slightly prefer the original to this one. There's just something so pure about that game and its setting, its aesthetics, and its overall simplicity, and the fact that it was the first one to introduce these elements. But I guess the first one doesn't have Goldman, so House of the Dead 2 supremacy. To be honest, a lot of my love for the first entry in the series comes from the allure of it being a game that got no home console release for anything that was relevant to me as a kid, so I wasn't really able to play it nearly as much as its sequel. The second game was a lot more accessible to me, and I rented it at least 3 times from Blockbuster because I loved it so much. Oh yeah, this disc also came with the House of the Dead 3. I have some opinions on this game, but first we should talk about a few more spin-offs. How about Pinball of the Dead? It's a pinball game for the Game Boy Advance with the House of the Dead 2 theming. There's also the Japan exclusive English of the Dead, a game meant for Japanese players to practice writing in English. I mean, it does roughly follow the original game, and some of the music is kinda here, except for when it's not and they completely replace it.
Crisp.
Kinda wish they brought this over to America as a way to practice Japanese, not gonna lie. The thought of House of the Dead 2's graphics and settings on the DS would have blown my mind as a kid. Sadly, we never got an actual House of the Dead game on the DS. Instead, we got a game called Touch the Dead.
Hey, don't touch me there.
Also known as Dead and Furious in Europe. I bring this game up because it's technically not a House of the Dead game, and it wasn't even made by Sega, but it clearly took inspiration from that series. In this game, you play as an inmate who's trapped in a prison, and the prison happens to be infested with zombies, so your goal becomes to escape. I always wanted a House of the Dead game on the DS, and I thought that the touchscreen would be a perfect way to attack zombies. And sure enough, some random dude working at this company must have had the exact same idea because we got this. I'll keep it brief. This game kinda sucks. All I need to do is show you this clip and you'll get an idea of what the issues are with the game. Reloading is the thing that makes this game especially painful, because you have to drag bullets into the chamber, and that's just really weird and finicky on a DS screen. The environments are bland, and there's barely any music. The prison is also just a really boring and shitty looking environment. Still, I thought it was worth noting that this game existed, and acknowledgement is all that it deserves.
James! Rogan! G and Harry are all right. Let's leave the rest to them. On we go. To our next battle.
Okay, well, now it's time to talk about The House of the Dead 3. This is easily my least favorite game in the series. Now, when saying that, I'm not trying to say that it's a bad game by any means. Far from it. But to me, this third installment actively takes away the vast majority of what made The House of the Dead 1 and 2 special to me. And in order to explain this, I'm gonna have to go through my handy dandy recipe once again. Charm. This game is set in a post-apocalyptic future in the distant year of 2019. Oh no. In this post-apocalyptic hellscape, you assume the role of Lisa Rogan, who just so happens to be the daughter of Thomas Rogan, the protagonist of the first game, and our boy G, making this his third consecutive appearance in the House of the Dead series. Well, I mean, Rogan also shows up at the end of 2 if you get the good ending, so there's that. Anyway, we get to play through this brief little prologue section where we follow Rogan as he fights zombies in this weird laboratory. He gets knocked the fuck out, and we cut to a few weeks into the future where Lisa and G are trying to track him down. The game that unfolds is their journey up the tower as they make their way to where Rogan is. Along the way, we get flashbacks that reveal some interesting and spicy lore to the series. We learn that Kyrian from the first game made the zombies because his son was sick, and he wanted to keep him alive. Wow, I never realized that Kyrian was just a misunderstood father. In the final level of the game, you meet up with Daniel Kyrian, the son that we keep flashing back to, and he's all grown up and he's actually a good guy. After teaming up with the both of you to take down the reincarnated Kyrian, everybody saves the day, I guess. There are still zombies everywhere, right? Right off the bat, graphics are a huge step forward from House of the Dead 2, and the zombies are looking as creepy as ever. There's a distinct shift in tone and feeling here. For starters, the voice acting is better. It's at least competent, but there's still a little bit of cheese to be found here. It's like when you go to Olive Garden and you want to ask for a little bit more cheese on your plate, but you feel kind of awkward asking for more, so you just say, no, that's fine, thanks. That's how much cheese is here.
Had enough yet?
Hey, we're just passing through.
Remember, Lisa, believe in yourself, no matter what happens.
Believe in yourself, Lisa.
Hey, don't touch me there.
I never was any good at gardening. It looks like it'll open if we shoot it. When a lady says no, she means it.
But overall, the game is trying to have a much more serious tone, and nowhere is that more evident than with the music. I really don't like this soundtrack. None of the tracks are bad, but I can't remember a single piece of music from this game. The original composer who worked on games 1 and 2 didn't return for this third entry, and what we have is your standard action movie, generic, orchestral suspense music. I mean, it does establish an oppressive tone, and that works for the game, but I also just find it really bland. To me, this is easily the worst soundtrack in the entire series. So much like how the first game in the series took place in a single location, giving the name House of the Dead a bit more relevance and significance, this game drops the city setting of 2 and takes place entirely outside and inside this weird facility building. The outside has a unique feel to it, but once you're inside, everything looks the same to me. The first two games had a bit of a dichotomy with their aesthetics and designs, with the first half being more gothic and spooky, Halloween-y, and the second half being more futuristic sci-fi. This game only really has labs and office spaces. Nothing's more exciting than an office. Overall, I feel like a lot of the personality that makes the House of the Dead special just kind of feels absent here. Not completely, but a lot of it. Initially, the game was actually planned to have a stylized, cel-shaded look, and while I'm not entirely sure if I would have liked it or not, it definitely would have been interesting to see what this turned out like. Number 2.
Pew pew.
No longer are you taking on zombies with these little bitch handguns. Now we have shotguns, and these kind of change how the game feels. The biggest change, believe it or not, comes from reloading. The arcade version lets you cock your shotgun to reload, which is really cool and immersive, but other versions, including the Wii one, which is what I'm playing, has the same reload system as before, and boy howdy is this awful. So get this, after each time you reload, there's about half a second where this animation plays out which shows your character reloading the gun, and while this is happening, you can't shoot. But let me tell you something, it's only half a second, but in a game as frantic as The House of the Dead 3, that half second has resulted in at least half of all the damage I've ever taken. To make matters worse, the bosses are designed totally differently here. Before, they had weak points and you just had to get a single shot in before they attacked, but now there's this extra meter, and the boss won't take damage until you get enough shots in to deplete it. Basically, you need to spam that shoot button to get enough damage in a very short window of time, but since you have half a second where you're not allowed to shoot after reloading, it makes these bosses way more difficult than they need to be. You basically need to be perfect and not miss a single shot, otherwise you're gonna get hit. Despite having 6 levels, there are only 4 bosses in total, one of which you fight twice. This boss right here, he's a guy that chases you throughout the level, and you take turns chipping away at his health while also fighting hordes of zombies. The concept is really cool, and I like his design quite a bit, but I also felt like we could have used another boss, especially since the others I find to be incredibly annoying to fight. The final boss, especially, is so painful and goes on forever. This is one of the sequences of the game that actively hurts my index finger. Ignoring that, shooting regular zombies still feels good, and on average there are a lot more on screen at any given point than there were in either of the previous games. I don't think that these sound effects are as crisp or nice sounding as I typically like, but that's just my personal preference and it still feels good to do. Number 3.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
There are no people here. Given that this game is set in a post-apocalyptic future, it makes sense that you wouldn't really encounter anyone. But that also means that the tense moments of trying to save civilians in the last game are gone. So what did they replace that with? Sometimes you'll have occasional moments where your partner G, or sometimes Lisa if you're playing as the second player, will be swarmed, and you have a tight window to rescue them. If you manage to pull it off successfully, you get a little bit of health. It's a neat concept that brings back some of the tension, but if you fail to save the other player, there's really no penalty. You just miss out on the extra life that you could have gotten. You can even shoot your partner and nothing happens, bullets just pass right through them. Is this implying that we've been dead the entire time? These don't change routes like before. Alternate routes still technically exist in the game, but rather than changing them through the gameplay and through the actions that you take, you basically select them off of a list. The first level gives you a choice between 2 routes, and then you have 3 levels to choose from. The order that you choose determines how things play out in the level. Aside from the first chapter, which lets you see 2 different areas, the level layouts themselves are pretty much exactly the same, and you don't really see any new rooms. The main things that change are enemy placement, and sometimes you'll go through the level backwards. Suffice it to say that this system is much less fun to me. I really loved how before the different routes were determined by the way that you played the game and were associated with the challenge of having to save the right people. Route changes felt earned, and it felt like a more spontaneous decision which suited a game all about frantically trying to react to zombie attacks. To me, this current system is a lot less fun since it's not actively part of the gameplay. The lack of civilians also affects how you get extra lives. At the end of each level, you're now graded based on how quickly you're able to take down zombies. So the game is constantly ranking your performance, and little messages will pop up on the left side of the screen telling you how good you did. Performing well enough is what you have to do in order to get extra lives by the end of each level. You're rewarded for headshots as well as getting 2 zombies at once, but what the game really wants you to do is take down zombies as quickly as possible and essentially speedrun the game. Zombies will sometimes fall to the floor, but not not be completely dead, so you're going to need to finish them off, and you're encouraged to shoot them since the screen doesn't advance until everyone is obliterated. What this does is test your skills and adds to the complexity of the overall zombie shooting, which I do feel is a welcome change. But I feel like this was a poor choice for this particular game, which forces you not to shoot half a second after reloading. Again, compounding on the issue, 6 bullets typically isn't enough to clear a screen full of zombies. That combined with the boss design makes me question the decision to do things the way that they were done here. I mean, the last 2 games were very similar, so it makes sense that the dev team would try to make this one stand out and be as different as possible, but to design a game that expects me to quickly and frantically take zombies down in a very short amount of time while consistently taking away my ability to shoot, I don't think the shotgun was the best choice for this game. Maybe I just suck and I need a lot more practice, but I don't know, man. I mean, I was able to beat the original game on a single quarter back when I still had access to an arcade cabinet with it installed, so I'm not incapable of being good at these games. With enough practice, I can probably get a perfect S rank on every level. As it stands right now, I've only ever been able to get an A, and that is a rare occurrence. Point is, according to my 3-point scale for the series, this is easily the worst one in my opinion. But again, it's just my opinion, and I know a lot of fans really like this game. Even though I've been bashing it for a while, it's still a very competent, very polished, and very well-made game, whenever I'm not yelling at my TV because I couldn't make a shot. It's a lot of fun, and I know a lot of creators who very much enjoy this game and consider it to be their favorite. It ultimately comes down to personal preference. I'm just a bit personally salty about the fact that my least favorite game in the series is the one that's easily the most accessible and easy to play on modern consoles, while my favorite is essentially forever lost to time. You can play this game on the original Xbox, the Wii as part of the 2 and 3 collection, the PS3, PC, and even the PS4 and PS5 through the PS Now service, although these are going to have to essentially be cloud versions that are streamed digitally, and you can't use PS Move controllers this way. Do yourself a favor and avoid playing this with a controller, but if you have access to any of these other platforms and you want to give this game a shot, don't let me stop you. I'd still recommend it. So with those opinions out of the way, it's time to go back to our Spinoff Corner. They made another Typing of the Dead game. The Typing of the Dead 2 is based on House of the Dead 3, much like how Typing of the Dead 1 was based on House of the Dead 2. Unfortunately, this game only ever released in Japan, but it doesn't really look like it does a whole lot new compared to the first Typing of the Dead. I haven't played it personally, but I'm sure it can be fun. Since House of the Dead 2 and 3 came out on the Wii and we've covered both of the mainline games to appear on this console, I think now's a good time to mention that Resident Evil, The Umbrella Chronicles, and Resident Evil, The Dark Side Chronicles exist. These 2 games essentially take you through abridged versions of the events from the first handful of games, and turn them into rail shooters similar to House of the Dead. I personally haven't had the chance to give these games a shot, but I do enjoy what these games are based off of, and it seems really cool to see these events with updated graphics. Well, I mean, most of these games already have remakes now, but it's cool to see these old interpretations of the games with updated graphics.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the House of the Shitty Voice Acting.
So with my harsh opinions on House of the Dead 3 out of the way, how do I feel about
The House of the Dead 4?
I think this is a step in the right direction, and is a game that I personally enjoy much more than 3, but I personally don't like it as much as 1 and 2. Okay, so releasing in 2005, this game is set in the year 2003, and it serves as a prequel to House of the Dead 3. The story follows our boy, the one, the only, the legendary James Taylor, and newcomer Kate Green as they essentially live through events that we can assume serve as the catalyst for the apocalypse in House of the Dead 3, while gathering intelligence information at A.M.S.'s underground facility because James believes that something is up and that the case isn't closed. I mean, Goldman literally said that a successor would come after yeeting himself off a building, so I don't know why you waited 3 years to do this, but whatever, it's already too late. An earthquake happens and the 2 leads are trapped underground for a few days. Soon enough, they end up being bombarded with zombies and need to make their way back up to the surface. Along the way, we catch flashbacks to our golden boy, Goldman, now in HD. Unfortunately, lacking a lot of the charm that he used to have, although he still rambles about the human condition or whatever. Eventually, both characters make it to the surface where they learn that everything is kind of fucked. But then Goldman sends them an airdrop and is like, oh, but there's still hope. Ah, classic Goldman. He may have killed everyone in the city, but he at least cares enough to look out for our golden boy James. These 2 book it to the Goldman building, the very same one from the end of House of the Dead 2. But unfortunately, James sustains an intense injury just before the big boss. This freaky thing is unleashed and all hope seems lost, but James has a plan. Dying. Damn, first Goldman, now James. All my favorite characters are dying. The credits roll and Goldman leaves a message saying that there may be hope after all. This is like the third time you've said this. Also, where the fuck is Gary? The story is once again more grounded in reality, and I say that with massive air quotes, aided by the improved voice acting, probably the best in the entire series, though not without its occasional hiccups.
Get out of my way!
Graphically and artistically, these environments are a big step up from 3 in my opinion. You go through underground labs, subway stations, malls, and eventually what's left of Venice, Italy. Graphics have been significantly improved once again, and these zombies are as creepy looking as ever. Lucky for me, the music here is significantly improved from House of the Dead 3. The style of music that they have here definitely does pump me up to do some fighting. It's a totally different vibe from anything that came before it, with this weird kind of techno-y EDM sounding stuff. I think this soundtrack strikes a good balance of being creepy and serious while also just being a vibe. Point number 2, Shooty Pooty. This game easily makes the most dramatic change to the overall gunplay. Handguns and shotguns have been replaced with Uzis, and you no longer have the need to fire off individual bullets. Instead, all you gotta do is hold down the trigger until your clip is empty, and then use shake to reload. This weapon is a lot more important because now there are a metric shit ton of zombies on screen at any given point. You also have grenades here, which can be used in a pickle when you're overwhelmed by enemies. This is much easier on my finger, but in terms of feel, this is much less satisfying to me. There's no crunch or impact to any of your attacks, and zombies don't fall apart like they used to. They sort of just vaporize into nothing, which makes sense given that simulating severed limbs and heads wouldn't be very easy to do with as many character models on screen. The sound effects that your gun makes also sound really weak, and as a result, I just don't think it feels as good to shoot things here. You have some unique bosses like spiders, big gabagools, as well as the return of the idea of a boss that pursues you as you're playing a level. There's also this edgelord that looks like something you'd fight in a JRPG. Again, the way that bosses work here is that you have to keep your cursor on the weak point of the enemy for as long as you possibly can, and I think this system works slightly better here than it did for House of the Dead 3. But I still feel like the style of health for enemies would have worked better with the shooting style from the first 2 games. You still have random boxes and barrels that you can shoot for extra points and extra health, just like in the previous 3 games, and yet again, you're graded based on your performance, meaning that the rating system from House of the Dead 3 makes its return, only now it's focused a bit more on accuracy over your speed. The overall increase in zombies is definitely exhilarating and does add some more zest to the House of the Dead formula, but I feel like it's held back just slightly by its game feel. It can still be challenging, and I like the addition of having to decide when and when not to use grenades. They do add a nice extra little layer to the game. Finally, progression. And like the last game, there are no civilians. It's the same city as House of the Dead 2, so it feels really good to know that all the people that I saved in that game are probably dead now. Rest in peace, old car man. Branching paths return, but instead of picking the level order and having that determine the path, the options are presented right in the middle of the level. It's something interesting, but it does also have the least complexity out of all these branching path systems. The choices are pretty rigid since you'll either go one way or the other, and you reconverge back on the main path after a short amount of time. This is easily the worst branching path system in the entire series because it doesn't really engage you very much, and you can see everything that this game has to offer in just 2 playthroughs. There's also nothing like these save the player segments from House of the Dead 3, which keeps the entire thing focused solely on the combat. Honestly, this game is a step back for me in a lot of ways, but I think it's saved by its unique atmosphere, cool music, and shakeups to the formula that, to me, help it stand out. With a proper light gun or PS Move controller, I'm sure this is bound to be a good time, and we're not even done talking about it. There was a sort of DLC for the game, a separate arcade machine called House of the Dead 4 Special, continuing right after the ending of the main game and giving us 2 extra levels. Distraught after the death of James, Kate goes on a quest to actually put a stop to the things that have been happening, and along the way, just so happens to bump into G, making this his 4th consecutive appearance in the mainline House of the Dead series. Where the fuck is Gary? The levels take place primarily out in the open streets of Venice and in a secret lab, reusing the first boss from the main game and ending with the return of the Magician, including a remixed version of his badass theme song. What made this machine stand out was the fact that you would go into this enclosed space, and on occasion the machine would actually rotate you 180 degrees to a screen behind you so that you could fight more zombies, basically turning the House of the Dead into Shrek 4D or Star Tours. This thing looks really fucking cool, but unfortunately this machine is poorly documented limited and is super rare and scarce, and probably doesn't exist anymore. Luckily, these levels are available by default as part of the PS3 release of House of the Dead 4.
You ever gonna tell anyone what that fucking G stands for?
No.
We actually have 2 more games to cover before we wrap up our main points, but before we do, how about some more spin-offs? Like a House of the Dead spin-off that's literally a dartboard called Darts of the Dead. Or how about the House of the Dead movies? Yes, these movies exist, and they are notoriously bad, often being brought up whenever the discussion about bad video game movies occurs.
Of the Dead, Overkill.
Not only is this the first House of the Dead game designed specifically for home consoles, that being the Wii, but it's also the first one not developed by Sega's A.M.S team, who were responsible for all of the numbered entries in the series. Overkill was created in 2009 by Headstrong Games, a European team, and begs the question, what would the House of the Dead be like if it were developed for Western audiences?
I'm gonna rip your motherfucking balls off!
If you're both finished admiring each other's dicks, can I remind you we have a fucking mass-murdering psychopath son of a bitch to catch?
Get ready to be titillated, tantalized, and teased by tassel-tittied temptresses.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I mean, it's all in the name. House of the Dead Overkill's overall styles and sensibilities exist so that Nintendo could be like, hey, the Wii's a serious console for big boy gamers. We got M-rated games too. And as such, this game had to overcompensate by adding tits and gore and the word fire truck, and it did so in excess. You could say it's a bit overkill. Inspired by grindhouse films, like the film literally titled Grindhouse, and underground cinema from the 70s, this game easily feels the most different from all of the others in the series, and that was by design. It was an intentional decision by producer Neil McEwen. I hope I said that right. The sense of humor and dialogue is definitely an acquired taste. It's clear that this team took a lot of the cheesiness and camp that the series had become known for, and intentionally leaned into their own version of that by making a game that doesn't take itself very seriously at all, which in a lot of ways I like. The writing did get a few chuckles out of me here and there with how absurd it could be at times, but after a while, the charm kind of starts to wear off for me. At times, it feels like the script was written by an edgy Xbox Live kid telling me how much he loves Quentin Tarantino and that he f***ed my dad or something. At one point, this game even held the world record for the most curse words said in a game, which on its own is really funny, but fire truck is said so many times in the game that it loses all meaning. It hasn't particularly aged well, it feels like a product of its time, and our leads do say things that would probably get them cancelled in 2021. It's the most different out of all the entries in the series, and I don't think I'm going to be spending a ton of time talking about this one since it's kind of more of a spin-off, and the creators haven't confirmed this as being canon to the numbered entries, so I'll just touch on it briefly. What we have here is the arcadey gameplay of games 1 through 4, but with longer levels, different weapon choices, and like I said before, raunchy humor. The game has a bold new style with this 70s filter and a soundtrack that, while nothing like the previous games, still kicks a lot of ass. I'm playing the extended cut of the game, which has 9 levels, 2 more than the original Wii version. These levels are much longer than anything from games 1 through 4. Starting up a new game, it'll take at least about 4 hours to get to the end. Civilian scenarios return, but there aren't any kind of branching paths to be experienced here, which is kind of a shame, but it's a much longer game, so it's not as big of a deal here. Gunplay is nice and crisp, but sometimes these alternate weapons can leave you ill-suited for certain chapters. They got rid of credits, and instead only your score is penalized whenever you lose all of your health, which I think is a smart decision for a game designed specifically for home console. The only thing holding this one back for me is the score system, which rewards accuracy over all else, but with the jerky camera that leads to me shooting at nothing when I don't mean to, and this results in my combo breaking. This ends up happening a lot. In spite of that, this game is a lot of fun, and a lot of that fun carries over into typing of the Dead Overkill. It's more typing the Dead, but since Overkill is longer, this game is also a much longer experience. This is what's available on Steam, and if you buy this, both games are included, so knock yourself out if you're interested.
Can I drive?
No.
Can I have a lollipop?
Yes.
Before we transition to the last game, I wanted to make a note of the fact that the House of the Dead Overkill got a mobile version. It was so bad that they took it off the App Store. You had to use a virtual analog stick to move this cursor, which makes no sense on a system with a literal touchscreen. Touch the Dead was an awful game, but at least it understood that a touchscreen should be used to touch zombies. Don't take that out of context. Alright, now that we've talked about every spin-off that's worth talking about, here we are at the House of the Dead Scarlet Dawn, the 5th installment in the franchise, once again developed by the core team responsible for the mainline games, and the first one not to be given a number. Released in 2018, this was the first House of the Dead to be released since House of the Dead 4 back in 2005, meaning that there was a 13-year gap between releases. Unfortunately, there's not really much that I can say about this one, as it's still exclusive to arcades and I don't have access to one where I live. But back in early 2020, before the events of this game kinda happened in the real world, I got to try a couple of levels, and I thought it was pretty neat. When I played it, I sat in this enclosed space and I was blasted with bursts of air and had surround sound, so that was pretty neat. I ran out of credits in the middle of the second level, so I didn't finish the game, so all I really have to go off of is this footage that's available online. And it looks like the House of the Dead 4, but with the multiple weapons of Overkill, the level selection and route mechanics of the House of the Dead 3, and a setting similar to House of the Dead 1. The story follows Kate Green from House of the Dead 4, who teams up with Ryan Taylor, the brother of James Taylor, who is unfortunately no longer with us. I never knew this guy existed. Where the fuck is Gary? This game takes place in 2006, 3 years after the apocalypse which unfolded in the House of the Dead 4, and I guess the human race is just chillin', but of course everything goes wrong, as it does, and there's a new villain to take down or whatever. The series once again returns to having awful voice acting, and I mean, wow, just listen to this clip.
Goldman and Curian were gone, but I was reborn from a fatal disease. I choose to be alive. You use selective words. What are you planning?
Can't you see it? The future looks plural, but in truth, there is just one. It is the time. The time for new life to be born in a new evolution.
This dude literally sounds like a 20-year-old trying to sound like an old man. It puts a smile on my face. We have homages to old bosses and references to prior story events and characters. And overall, I think the creators are showing a lot of love for the series here. This really feels like an amalgamation of everything from the first 4 games. If I get the chance to go to a Round 1 or Dave & Buster's in the future, I definitely want to give this game a proper playthrough and do some kind of a follow-up in a future video. For now, arcades are the only option, and having lived through 2020, I don't know how much of a future there really is for this franchise at arcades. The end of this game hints at a sequel, and I'd love to see a core entry for home consoles made by the AM1 team. Yeah, none of the modern consoles have an ideal controller setup for this type of game, but that's where I think VR could come in. Come on, this series makes perfect sense for VR, and it would perfectly amp up the immersion. Sure, it would make a lot of people nauseous, but that's why you would design the levels and mechanics around VR so that you wouldn't be whipping and snapping as much as you do in these games. PSVR, Oculus, whatever, I don't care, just make it happen, Sega. Luckily, we don't have to wait too long for whatever is up next on the horizon, as the thing that we have to look forward to now is a remake of the very first game, the one that desperately needed a remake the most. I can't wait for it to eventually release, and hopefully that'll be sometime this year so I can finally own some sort of physical copy of the game. But as I alluded to almost an hour ago, I'm kinda nervous, for a few reasons. It's keeping the exact same level layout and gameplay, and the graphics do be looking crisp though. The game is being worked on by Forever Entertainment, the team responsible for the remake of Panzer Dragoon, another classic shooter game, and this release was notoriously bad, with the game coming out unfinished. They did publicly acknowledge that that game released unfinished, and have stated that what we saw of the House of the Dead remake earlier this year is more polished than Panzer Dragoon was when it launched. Rumblings online have stated that there will be new music that quote-unquote takes inspiration from the original soundtrack. The soundtrack is one of the defining aspects of the original game, and I hope that this new soundtrack can capture what I love about that game. Hell, they should just hire Trex45 from YouTube, I hope I'm saying their name right. They remade every single piece of music from the game and it rips so fucking hard. Listen to this. I've also used some of this music as background music in this very video, and I suggest checking out their channel if you're at all interested. I hope that the remake soundtrack is something more along the lines of this, because this is pretty sweet. The last thing that has me concerned is, well, this thing. On the surface, it looks like it does the same thing as the Wii Remote, but if you've played a motion control game on the Switch, then you know exactly how susceptible this thing is to drifting, which is going to be a real drag in a game about precise shooting. All of the footage shown in trailers so far has the cursors moving as though they're being moved by an analog stick, and that just sounds awful. I desperately hope that they figure out some kind of control scheme that works for the game. There's also supposedly a PC port in the works, which would fix a lot of the issues that I have since you could use a mouse, and it's probably going to have some modder adding support for a Wii Remote at some point. We also might potentially get a retro graphics mode, but only if there's enough demand for it, and being the cynical asshole that I am, I'm gonna predict that there in fact will not be enough demand. But maybe. I hope people buy it. At the end of the day, I love every game in this franchise, and I'm so grateful that The House of the Dead 1 is getting a remake at all. The date is set for 2021, and October is almost over, so it's only a matter of time. To all the developers at Forever Entertainment, I wish you the best of luck as you continue working on this project, and I look forward to seeing what the final product ends up being. As soon as this remake comes out, I am 100% going to check it out, and most likely I'll make a follow-up video. In the meantime, I'm going to play some 2 on the Wii and enjoy this glorious month of October. Until then, happy Halloween everyone, if you're watching this in October, and thank you for listening to me ramble for over an hour about a shooty zombie game. If you want to see more stuff that I make, then you should subscribe, and if you've played any of the House of the Dead games, let me know down below which one's your favorite. I'll spook you next time.